It was the spring of 2009 when the first call was placed. The neighborhood was already weary of the abandoned property. Its roof sagged, its siding peeled like dead skin, and its windows reflected nothing but shadows. On the night of March 18th, just after 2 a.m., a woman named Clara, known to neighbors as a quiet, no-nonsense mother of two, picked up her phone and dialed 311. Her voice was calm at first, but firm. She explained that she had been awake, folding laundry, when she heard something unusual from across the street. At first, it was faint, like a whimper carried on the wind. But then it grew sharper, more urgent. It was the sound of a child crying. She muted the television, held her breath, and listened carefully. The sound persisted: sobs, broken gasps, even the muffled hiccuping rhythm of a young child who had been crying too long. "It's coming from the house across the street," she told the operator. "The one nobody lives in." There was no hesitation in her words. She wasn't asking for reassurance. She was demanding an answer. Clara later explained that the cries seemed layered, as though more than one child was inside. Sometimes it sounded like one voice, but then others would join, soft, high-pitched, trembling. What chilled her most was not the noise itself, but the way it carried. It didn't echo like a sound coming from outdoors. It didn't drift in and out as if from a television or a passerby. It seemed trapped inside the house, bouncing against its walls, pushing outward through broken glass and rotted wood. "They're in there," she insisted to the operator. "And they're scared." Dispatchers logged her complaint as possible trespassers or minors in distress. Within the hour, a pair of city responders and later a police cruiser arrived. Flashlights sliced through the darkness, their beams catching on overgrown weeds and the rusting shell of a tricycle abandoned in the yard. Neighbors peeked through curtains as the officers approached the porch. The crying had not stopped. It was still faintly audible, rising and falling like waves. Yet by the time the door was pried open and the responders stepped inside, silence fell. The house's interior told its own story of neglect. Wallpaper peeled in strips, furniture sat broken and overturned, and the smell of mildew clung to every surface. The responders swept each room, calling out, "Is anyone here? Hello?" Their voices seemed to vanish into the still air, absorbed rather than echoed. According to the report, they searched the living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms. Nothing. No signs of recent activity. No footprints in the dust. No broken locks. Just decay and emptiness. But then, as they reached the hallway near the stairs, one officer claimed to hear it again. A single sob, faint and close. He described it later as the sound of a child's breath catching between cries, like when they're trying not to cry but can't hold it in. They rushed to the source, an upstairs closet, but found it completely empty. Dust undisturbed, shelves bare. Yet the sound had been so clear, so real, that one of the responders wrote in his notes, "I'd swear on my badge there was a kid inside." The incident ended the same way many would after it, with confusion and dismissal. After nearly 40 minutes of searching, the responders concluded there was no evidence of trespass, no minors in danger, no crime committed. They closed the report as unfounded. Clara, however, never accepted that. She told her neighbors later that she continued to hear the crying long after the officers left. Sometimes faint, sometimes sharp enough to wake her children. She even claimed that, on one occasion, her youngest son sat up in bed and asked her, "Mom, why are there kids in the walls?" That first complaint planted the seed of unease in the neighborhood. It marked the beginning of a pattern, a cycle that would repeat 6 more times. And while the official record reduced the event to nothing more than a false alarm, those who were there, the caller, the neighbors, even the officers, could never quite shake the feeling that they had brushed against something unexplainable, something waiting inside that house. Complaint number 1 was the first voice in a chorus that would only grow louder. The second official complaint came less than a year later, in January of 2010. Winter had gripped the city. Snow piled thick on sidewalks, and the abandoned house sat buried in white like a grave marker. The caller this time was a delivery driver, a man named Daniel, who stopped his van at the intersection just opposite the property. He later told dispatchers that the night was silent except for the hum of his engine, until he heard it. The sound of crying, faint but distinct, drifting from the house. He thought at first it must be a television left on, or perhaps a homeless family seeking shelter. But as he sat listening, he saw movement. A pale face pressed against the upstairs window. He described it as small, childlike, the forehead and nose smudging against the glass as if peering out. But what disturbed him most was how long it stayed there. Motionless, expressionless, staring directly at him. It didn't blink, he later said. It just watched. He reported the incident immediately, afraid that children were trapped inside in the freezing cold. When responders arrived, Daniel remained parked across the street, pointing to the very window where he had seen the face. But by the time flashlights illuminated the house, the window was empty. The upstairs glass reflected only beams of light and drifting snow. Officers entered again, their boots crunching against icy steps, breath fogging in the frigid air. Inside, the cold was sharper, bitter, as though the house itself had been drained of warmth. They swept each floor carefully, noting signs of disrepair. Collapsed ceiling beams, peeling wallpaper, broken furniture frozen stiff with ice. No footprints disturbed the fresh snow outside. No evidence of forced entry could be found. Yet as they climbed to the second floor, Daniel swore from outside that he saw movement again, this time in a different window. A fleeting shadow, the outline of something small ducking back into the dark. He shouted to them, waving frantically, but when the officers looked, the room was empty. Their flashlights revealed only dust floating in the air like falling ash. According to their official notes, the officers did hear something during the sweep. A faint sound that resembled crying, but distant, muffled, almost as if coming through a wall or a radio buried beneath the floorboards. One officer described it as like listening to a recording of a child sobbing. Not an actual child. They traced it to the basement, descending narrow steps that groaned under their weight. Down there, the air grew damp and heavy, the smell of mold clinging to their lungs. They shone their lights across the stone walls, where water stains spread like veins. At one point, the crying seemed clearer, sharper, coming from a corner where broken pipes jutted from the ground. But the closer they came, the more the sound dissipated, until it was gone entirely. No children, no squatters, no trespassers, just an empty basement. One officer later admitted that he refused to step beyond the last stair, claiming he felt a sudden grip of cold hands around his ankle. His partner laughed it off, but he insisted it wasn't his imagination. After nearly an hour of searching, the investigation was closed once again. No persons located. No unlawful activity. The official report reads sterile and simple, but Daniel's own account paints a darker picture. He left that night shaken, certain of what he saw. He told friends he could still picture the child's face against the glass, pale, blank, impossibly still. He stopped delivering on that street altogether, rerouting his schedule to avoid passing the house again. Neighbors whispered about the incident, and Clara, the woman who made the first complaint, felt vindicated. She knew she wasn't alone in what she had heard. But there was something different this time, an escalation. It wasn't only crying anymore. Now there were sightings. Now the house wasn't just a place where voices lingered. It was a place where something seemed to watch back. Complaint number 2 cemented the house's reputation, turning whispers into warnings. What had once been dismissed as imagination was now a growing, undeniable pattern. By late 2011, the house had become more than a curiosity. It was a silent predator looming over the block. The third complaint came not from a neighbor, but from a city maintenance crew assigned to inspect the property. Their task was simple: verify the structure's safety after reports of trespassers. The crew arrived in the afternoon, 2 men in reflective vests carrying clipboards and flashlights. First, everything seemed routine. They circled the perimeter, noting broken windows, sagging beams, and signs of decay. But when they reached the side entrance, both paused. From somewhere deep inside the house came the unmistakable sound of children laughing, high-pitched, playful, the kind of laughter one expects from a schoolyard. One worker joked nervously, "Guess the place ain't empty after all." Yet as they stood there listening, the laughter changed. It slowed, dragged out, stretching into a low wail that no longer sounded like joy. Both men froze, the hair rising on their arms. They immediately called their supervisor, who in turn filed an official 311 complaint. The responders arrived within the hour, police joining the maintenance crew at the scene. Once again, the house was entered, flashlights slicing through its shadows. The men reported a charged atmosphere, as though the walls themselves vibrated faintly with sound. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, they found something new, faint markings on the wall at child height. Crayon strokes, crude stick figures, a sun, what might have been a house. The drawings looked faded, as though decades old, yet no reports existed of families living there in years. As they inspected further, one officer heard a faint scratching sound behind the plaster, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging along wood. He tapped the wall. Silence. Then, faintly, a giggle. The sound was so sharp and close that the maintenance worker who heard it swore it came from right beside his ear. He dropped his flashlight, refused to pick it up, and demanded to leave immediately. His partner stayed longer, but later admitted that the air in that room felt alive, breathing, watching. The basement once again became the focal point. Descending the crumbling stairs, 2 officers reported hearing muffled sobbing, the same as previous complaints. But this time, the sound rose suddenly into panicked screams. Children's voices crying out as if in pain, layered on top of one another, reverberating through the stone walls. The men rushed forward, convinced someone was trapped. Their lights revealed nothing, only mold, old pipes, damp concrete. The screams cut off as abruptly as they began, leaving silence so total it rang in their ears. At that moment, one officer swore he felt something tug at his jacket, a small hand pulling backward. Spinning around, he found nothing. But when he examined his coat later, faint smudges shaped like fingerprints clung to the fabric, gray with dust. The incident was recorded, though the detail of the fingerprints was never entered into the official report. The maintenance crew, shaken beyond reason, flatly refused to continue their inspection. Their supervisor backed them, citing psychological distress. The third complaint marked a turning point. Until then, the house had been regarded as eerie but harmless, a curiosity rather than a threat. After this night, its reputation changed. City workers began refusing assignments related to the property, claiming it was unsafe, not because of its structure, but because of something inside. Rumors spread quickly. Whispers of laughter heard in daylight, the sight of small hands pressed against the glass, muffled cries echoing even when the house was locked and empty. Residents now avoided the street altogether, some even moving away. Clara, the first caller, warned neighbors not to walk past at night, claiming the cries had grown bolder, louder, as if feeding on attention. Officially, complaint number 3 was once again filed as unfounded. But between themselves, the responders admitted the truth. They all heard it. They all felt it. And though the paperwork reduced the event to nothing more than no persons found, those who entered that night knew the house wasn't empty. It never had been. The third complaint marked a turning point. Until then, the house had been regarded as eerie but harmless, a curiosity rather than a threat. After this night, its reputation changed. City workers began refusing assignments related to the property, claiming it was unsafe, not because of its structure, but because of something inside. Rumors spread quickly. Whispers of laughter heard in daylight, the sight of small hands pressed against the glass, muffled cries echoing even when the house was locked and empty. Residents now avoided the street altogether, some even moving away. Clara, the first caller, warned neighbors not to walk past at night, claiming the cries had grown bolder, louder, as if feeding on attention. Officially, complaint number 3 was once again filed as unfounded. But between themselves, the responders admitted the truth. They all heard it. They all felt it. And though the paperwork reduced the event to nothing more than no persons found, those who entered that night knew the house wasn't empty. It never had been. The fourth complaint was filed in the autumn of 2012, on a night when heavy rain turned the streets into rivers of black water. The storm knocked out power across several blocks, plunging the neighborhood into darkness. It was in this blackout that the cries returned, louder than ever. The caller was a retired man named Joseph, who lived 2 doors down. He had been sitting at his kitchen table with a lantern when he heard it. A chorus of children sobbing, carried over the storm, clear enough to rise above the pounding rain. He stepped to his porch, certain that children were trapped in the abandoned house during the storm. Through sheets of water, he swore he saw light flickering inside, like a candle or lantern glowing faintly in the upstairs window. Alarmed, he dialed 311, repeating over and over, "There are kids in there. Someone's trapped inside. They need help now." His voice cracked as he told the operator he could hear them screaming. The call was logged and responders were dispatched, but by the time they arrived, the storm had already swollen the yard into a swamp of mud and debris. Police officers entered first, their flashlights slicing through the pitch-dark interior. Water dripped through the ceiling, pooling on the warped wooden floors. The house groaned with every gust of wind, as though the storm outside was trying to rip it apart. At first, the only sound was the drip of rain and the creak of rotten boards. Then, faintly, came the cries, dozens of voices rising together in muffled desperation. One officer swore they were coming from upstairs. Another insisted they echoed from the basement. As they argued, the sound shifted, weaving between floors, darting from corner to corner like something alive. When they finally climbed to the second floor, they found something new. Fresh handprints smeared along the hallway wall, streaked in muddy water. The prints were small, child-sized, and dripping wet, as though the children had just touched the wall moments earlier. Yet the hall was empty, the air cold and still. Rain blew in through a broken window, but no footprints marked the soaked floorboards. The officers stood frozen, staring at the handprints that should not have been there. The team pressed forward, determined to locate the source. They entered a bedroom where the cries seemed strongest, only for the noise to cut off instantly when they stepped inside. Their flashlights revealed overturned furniture, a shattered mirror, and deep scratches carved into the wooden doorframe. The marks were uneven, frantic, as if small fingernails had clawed at the wood. One officer leaned close, running his light along the grooves, when he noticed something etched into the scratches. Numbers. A shaky 4. Carved again and again, overlapping itself until the wood splintered. The silence in the room was unbearable. Then, suddenly, a sound erupted from the closet, violent pounding, as though fists were hammering from inside. The officers yanked the door open, only to find emptiness. Dust swirled in their lights, and the pounding stopped as abruptly as it began. Yet the door itself bore fresh dents. The wood bowed inward. They knew what they heard. They knew what they saw. But nothing living was there to explain it. The report was filed the following morning, again listed as unfounded. But the responders who were there told a different story among themselves. Joseph, the caller, refused to sleep in his house for weeks, insisting the cries continued long after the officers left. He later told neighbors that sometimes he woke in the night to find muddy handprints streaked across his own porch railing, prints that vanished by morning. The officers avoided talking publicly about the incident, but one privately admitted he had recurring nightmares of the pounding closet door. More disturbing was the pattern that began to emerge. Each complaint seemed to leave behind a physical reminder, as though the house was marking its own history. First the cries, then the sightings, then the laughter, now the handprints and scratches. The number 4, carved repeatedly into the wood, sealed it. The house was counting, keeping track, documenting its own progression. And with every new complaint, the line between sound and substance blurred a little more. The fifth complaint came in late 2014, during the height of summer. The air was thick and suffocating, the kind of heat that pressed down on the city and made every sound travel farther than it should. The caller was a utility worker named Martin, who had been sent to check the gas lines that ran beneath the block. He parked his truck across from the house just after midnight, intending to finish the job quickly before the heat grew worse the next day. But as he unloaded his tools, a sound cut through the still night, the soft whimpering of a child. He froze, listening. The whimper grew into a cry, then into a chorus of sobbing voices that seemed to rise from the abandoned house. At first, he assumed squatters or runaway children were hiding inside. But then he noticed something far stranger. The cries weren't echoing outward. They were pulling inward, as though the house itself was swallowing the sound, holding it tightly in its rotten frame. With a trembling hand, Martin dialed 311, his voice shaking as he insisted someone was trapped inside. This time, the responders arrived with more caution. The history of the address was already well known in their department, and the officers who had been there before whispered warnings to the newcomers. Still, procedure required an inspection. They entered through the warped front door, their flashlights sweeping across the same ruined interior, but almost immediately, the atmosphere felt different. The air was stifling, humid, as if the summer heat had concentrated within the walls. One officer later wrote that it smelled like wet soil and spoiled fruit, thick enough to choke on. The cries began almost as soon as they entered, close, sharp, as though children were weeping in the very next room. They followed the sound to the living room, only to find it empty. Dust swirled in the beams of their lights, but the cries persisted, circling around them, slipping from one corner of the house to another. Martin, waiting outside, swore he could see shadows moving through the upstairs windows, small figures darting quickly, just out of sight. When he shouted this to the officers inside, the crying stopped. And then something else began. From the silence came a new sound, whispers. Not clear words, but hushed, urgent voices layered on top of one another. Too many to count. The whispers seemed to seep from the walls, vibrating in the air. One officer described it as standing inside a crowded room where everyone was murmuring secrets at once. None of them understandable, but all of them directed at you. The men pressed on, their nerves unraveling. In the hallway, one officer suddenly gasped, dropping his flashlight. He swore he felt something tug sharply at his sleeve, as if a child's hand had grabbed hold. Another claimed his radio crackled with static, but inside the noise he could make out faint words, "Stay with us." The basement was avoided at first, but eventually one officer descended halfway down the stairs. He froze when the crying erupted again, this time right behind him. Spinning with his light, he saw nothing, but he felt hot breath against his ear, followed by a sharp, piercing giggle. Shaken, he refused to go further, retreating upstairs without another word. The fifth complaint ended in chaos. The officers abandoned their search prematurely, shaken and unwilling to continue. Their official report made no mention of the whispers, the tugging hand, or the disembodied breath. But Martin, the utility worker, never forgot. He quit his job within months, telling colleagues he could no longer go near the house. What disturbed him most wasn't the cries or the whispers. It was what he saw as the officers left. Through the second-floor window, a pale figure appeared once again. But unlike the earlier sightings, this one moved. A small child stood in the window, shoulders trembling as though crying. Then, slowly, it lifted its hand and waved. Not frantic, not desperate. Just a calm, deliberate wave, directed at Martin. And then it vanished. He drove away shaking, certain he had witnessed something neither living nor dead. By this point, the house was no longer just haunted by sounds. It had begun to acknowledge those who dared to enter. Complaint number 5 marked the shift from mystery to menace. The house was no longer hiding. It was reaching out. By 2016, the abandoned house had a reputation that spread far beyond the neighborhood. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside. Paranormal bloggers wrote posts about it. And yet the official city stance remained unchanged. No evidence of criminal activity. No occupants located. Then came the 6th complaint, filed on a frigid November night. The caller was a young woman named Elena, who had just moved into a rental down the block. She hadn't yet heard the local rumors, hadn't learned the whispered warnings. That night, As she walked home from a late shift, she froze when she passed the old property. The sound of crying rose from inside, unmistakable. But this time, it was not just crying. It was mixed with something else. Laughter. At first, it sounded like children giggling, but soon it warped into something distorted, jagged, and wrong. The laughter overlapped with the sobs, weaving together into a grotesque chorus that made her stomach turn. She hurried home, locked her doors, and dialed 311, whispering into the phone as though afraid the house itself might hear her. Responders arrived less than an hour later, already uneasy as they stepped into the icy wind. Their flashlights caught the familiar warped boards, the sagging roof, the gaping windows like hollow eyes. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the crying began again, loud, echoing, and everywhere at once. But then, over the sobs, a high-pitched laugh erupted. It wasn't playful. It was mocking. One officer swore the sound mimicked his own nervous chuckle, as if the house were repeating it back at him. They pressed deeper inside, searching room after room. In the kitchen, they discovered something new. Tiny handprints smeared across the walls, but not in mud or dust this time. These were darker. They appeared wet, glistening in the beams of their lights. One officer recoiled, whispering that it looked like blood. The prints led across the floor, up the walls, and stopped abruptly at the ceiling, as though the children had climbed upward into the dark. The air grew thick with the smell of iron, and the crying swelled again, layered with laughter that rattled through the walls like broken glass. The basement once again pulled at them. They descended together, radios crackling with static. At first, the sound below was faint, like soft weeping carried through pipes. But as they reached the final steps, the voices erupted all at once. Dozens of cries and shrieks, mixed with laughter so sharp it felt inhuman. One responder screamed that he saw faces in the concrete. Tiny outlines of mouths and eyes stretching from the damp stains on the walls, mouths opening and closing in silent screams. His partner dismissed it as a trick of the light, but admitted later he could no longer breathe properly in that basement. The crying grew unbearable, louder than any human voice should be. And then it stopped. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. The men stood frozen until a new sound emerged. 3 slow knocks on the basement wall. Then, a whisper. So clear they all heard it. 6. That was enough. Terrified, they fled the house without finishing the sweep, unwilling to face what they felt waiting in the dark. The official report sanitized the event. As always, searched property. No activity noted. No signs of occupancy. But the responders who were there told a very different story afterward. One refused to return to duty for weeks. Another requested a transfer to a different district entirely. Elena, the caller, moved out within months, telling her landlord she couldn't stand the sound of children crying outside her window every night. The neighbors who remained avoided the street altogether, and by then, the house had become a place no one entered willingly. What disturbed investigators most, however, was not the crying or the laughter. It was the whisper. Never before had the house spoken. Never before had it acknowledged the number of complaints. But on that night, with its single clear word, it proved something chilling. It was aware. It was counting. And with 6 etched into memory, everyone knew what was coming next. The house was waiting for its 7th call. The last complaint came on a cold night in February of 2017. Snow clung to the rooftops, the streets were hushed under a heavy frost, and the abandoned house loomed like a dark monument. The caller was a middle-aged woman named Ruth, who had lived on the block her entire life. She was used to the strange noises that neighbors whispered about, but that night was different. The cries weren't faint or fleeting. They were deafening. She described it later as if dozens of children were inside, screaming all at once, their sobs cutting through the icy air like sirens. It wasn't a sound that could be ignored. It shook her windows, rattled her dishes, made her dog bark and claw at the back door in terror. Shaking, Ruth picked up her phone and dialed 311. Her voice on the recording was frantic, trembling. "They're louder than ever," she told the operator. "Why won't anyone help them? Please, they're in pain, I know they are." Behind her voice, faintly captured on the call, the sounds of children crying bled into the audio. Responders arrived quickly, already dreading the assignment. They had heard the stories of the house, had read the files, and some had even been there during earlier complaints. But nothing could prepare them for what they encountered that night. As soon as they stepped onto the property, the noise engulfed them. It wasn't faint anymore. It was thunderous, pouring from every crack and hole in the house. Children wailing, screaming, begging. But layered over it, sharp and cruel, was laughter. Not innocent laughter, but shrill, mocking, jagged, as if the cries themselves were being ridiculed by unseen voices. When they opened the front door, the sound did not dim, it grew. It pressed against their ears, vibrated in their skulls, made their flashlights tremble in their hands. The walls were smeared with fresh handprints, wet and dripping as though pressed there moments before. They covered every surface, hallways, doors, even the ceiling. The responders moved cautiously, their nerves unraveling. One muttered that it felt less like they were entering a house and more like they were stepping into a mouth. As they advanced through the rooms, the cries began to shift. No longer scattered, the voices grew focused, concentrated, as if gathering together in one place. They followed the sound to the basement door. It rattled violently, shaking on its hinges as though fists were pounding from the other side. The officers hesitated, but protocol forced them forward. When they pulled it open, the noise blasted out. Screams layered on screams, mixed with harsh, cutting laughter that scraped against their eardrums. They descended slowly, lights flickering, radios buzzing with static. At the bottom, they stopped cold. The walls were covered with more drawings, crayon marks, stick figures holding hands, crude depictions of a house, of children with hollow faces. In the center of the floor was a circle of small chairs, each overturned, as if abandoned mid-play. And then the crying stopped. Total silence swallowed them. One responder whispered that he felt surrounded, as though something unseen pressed close from all sides. Then, clear as day, a single voice cut through the silence. 7. The basement erupted. The chairs clattered across the floor, shadows danced across the walls though no lights moved, and the cries returned all at once, louder than anything human throat could produce. The responders panicked. One claimed he felt dozens of small hands grab at his ankles, tugging him toward the center of the room. Another said he heard his own name whispered in his ear, repeated again and again by a child's voice. Their radios crackled violently, capturing fragments of sobs and laughter, none of it human. Terrified, they fled, abandoning their search and refusing to re-enter. The official record of complaint number 7 is brief, sterile, and incomplete. It notes only that the property was inspected and no persons were found. But Ruth's call tells the real story. The audio recording ends with her sobbing, begging the operator to send more help, before her voice cuts off mid-scream. There is no follow-up, no closure. The house fell silent in the records after that night. But to those who still live nearby, the cries never stopped. After complaint number 7, no further 311 calls were ever logged for the house. Officially, the file was marked closed due to inactivity, but the silence that followed only deepened the mystery. Neighbors whispered their own explanations. Some claimed the cries belonged to children who had perished decades earlier in a fire that gutted the house, their souls forever trapped in the blackened walls. Others believed the voices were not of children at all, but of something older, something that wore the sound of innocence like a mask to lure the living inside. A few swore the house itself was alive, feeding on fear, growing stronger with each complaint, each set of ears that dared to listen. The chilling detail that haunted every theory was the counting. Each time, louder, clearer, until the final whisper of 7. If the house was counting, what would have come next? A ritual completed? A seal broken? Or simply the end of anyone foolish enough to answer the 8th call? Today, the house still stands, rotting, silent, its windows gaping like open wounds. Urban explorers who enter claim to hear faint sobs in the dark, always just out of sight. Some say they've recorded laughter on their devices, a mocking giggle that cuts through static. And then, sometimes, when the night is at its stillest, the cries grow so loud they seem to bleed into the street. People pause, listening, frozen. But no one calls 311 anymore. Not after the last voice said 7. Because everyone knows, if the line rings again, the complaint won't be filed by a neighbor. It will be complaint number 8, and this time, the house won't let the caller leave. The abandoned house stands silent now, its windows shattered, its roof sagging, its walls choking with ivy. Officially, there is nothing left to investigate. 7 complaints, 7 inspections, 7 denials. No evidence of children, no bodies, no proof, just paperwork buried in dusty archives, dismissed as neighborhood hysteria. And yet, those who live nearby know the truth. They hear the cries still, drifting on cold nights, weaving through the empty street like smoke. Some claim the house breathes, exhaling sorrow and inhaling fear. Others swear the 7th complaint was never the end at all, but a warning that something was completed when the voice whispered 7. Theories spread like infection. A curse, a ritual, a trap set for the living. But all carry the same unshakable certainty. The house is not finished. It waits, it listens, and it counts. The city may have closed its file, but the cries were never silenced. Anyone who walks too close swears they hear them. Faint at first, then louder, pressing, demanding to be acknowledged. Some resist. Some cannot. What happens if someone answers, if another call is made, if complaint number 8 is ever filed? That question lingers like a blade at the throat of the story. Because maybe the cries are not echoes of the past. Maybe they are invitations. And maybe the next voice added to them will not be a ghost at all, but a living soul who made the mistake of listening. So the house stands, patient and rotting, its halls heavy with shadows and whispers. And the only thing more terrifying than the sound of children crying inside is the silence that comes right after.